Thank you for the invitation to present my paper with my colleague Efraim Sadka. The paper deals with governance within a federal system, and the most famous federal systems nowadays are Europe, the European Union, and the USA, and I'll basically compare the European system, federal system, with the American federal system in order to understand how governance matters. So the scope of my presentation is that Europe and America have been strikingly different recently, as you know, in the way they handle the coronavirus pandemic. In terms of big relief packages, US overtook many countries within the European Union, and the rollout of vaccination was much more efficient in the USA in comparison to countries within the European Union. But this is sort of the things on the surface. I would like to go more deep into the structural differences between Europe and America. And I would argue that governance differences in the two federal systems matters also for the migration policy, specifically migrants' skill composition. They matter also for the tax burden and the generosity of the welfare state. So that is my task, to connect between governance issues within the federal system and migration, tax burden, and welfare state. Now, in terms of the welfare state generosity, I would like to quote Angela Merkel. She claimed that the European Union accounts for roughly 7% of the world population, but 25% of GDP and over 50% of its welfare spending. Compared to that, the US welfare spending is only a fraction of that. And in this graph, you can see how the general government expenditure in percentage of GDP, excluding defense, can compare the 20 EU countries, which are the top graph, and the USA, which is the bottom graph. And you can see that over the years, always government expenditure in the European Union countries are much more than in the US. We know that US is a fiscal union, whereas the European Union is very far from being a fiscal union. We also know that labor mobility within the US is far more intense than labor mobility in the European Union. So We know from Mandel and Peter Kennan, the international economist, that the more labor mobility and the more efficient is the currency union you have, and also the more fiscal union, the more efficient is also the currency union. And if you have currency union, you can actually shape better the efficiency of policies, macro policies, and the US is much more efficient currency union than the US. And most importantly, the fiscal union, the way the central government controls budgets across all the member states is also important for how efficient is all sort of government spending and taxation. And most importantly, if you have a fiscal union and more and a larger share of federal taxation, you avoid tax competition between states. So monetary and fiscal coordination, which is much more dominant in the US as a federal system, is more efficient, the greater is labor mobility, and the stronger is the fiscal union. And you can see from this table, I'll try to show it slightly better, that migration policy for the federation, migration coming out of the federation into the federation. In the EU, the composition, the skill composition of migrants is much more biased towards low skill, much higher share of primary education of migrants in Europe relative to the US. And we just mentioned that labor mobility is much stronger across states or member states of the federal system in America relative to Europe. So keep in mind these regularities, empirical regularities, and I would like to set up a model that actually give us a tool to analyze the essential reasons for the differences in welfare state generosity and composition of migration. So the modeling purpose is to explore analytically the consequences for member states with the federal system of fiscal coordination in the federation versus fiscal competition in the federation. So of course the analogy is that there is more fiscal coordination within the US and more fiscal competition within the EU. And the consequences for member states are threefold: the provision of social benefits by the welfare state, taxes on labor relative to the taxes on capital, and high skill versus low skill migration. So the modeling purpose is to find a way, a simple way to analyze the consequences of coordination versus competition across these 1, 2, 3 items. So I'll skip the details of the model. It's quite simple and standard. I just flesh it out here for a quick look. It has the supply side. It has the usual arbitrage across states because of perfect, efficient capital mobility within the federal system across states, and the very standard preferences. And these preferences allow us to write down the indirect utility, V, for an individual in a given member state in terms of wages, capital, and so forth. And finally, in terms of the model, we have the government budget, very standard. So on the right-hand side, you can see the revenue from taxes on labor and capital. And on the left-hand side, we assume a universal social benefit B. And then we compare for this model a intra-federation competitive regime, which is basically expressed in equations 11 to 16. And we compare it to a coordination regime. And in the coordination regime, the main difference is that reservation utility, we are talking about people that can move freely across member states to seek where they reside and work. So the reservation utilities before you move from one state to another is a critical variable. And the main difference between the coordination regime and the competition regime is that in the competition regime, each member state doesn't affect the reservation utility outside of its borders, whereas in the coordination regime, because of the coordination, what happens within each state will take into account the migration and the reservation utilities. So the reservation utilities become endogenous as we speak, whereas the reservation utilities in the competition regime are exogenous. And it is creating a fiscal externality because within competition regime, each state is trying to compete on high-skilled labor and other things, and also in terms of the provision of social benefits. And there is sort of a fiscal externality that it shed into other member states. And this model allows us to analyze this fiscal externality. Now, what are the results of this stylized model? Before we go to the result, I would like to underscore again the main issue of fiscal externality, which is behind the whole results. So Each union member country in a competitive regime obviously balances the margin, on the margin, the gains and losses from migration. In doing so, each country is basically a utility taker or reservation utility taker. It takes the well-being of migrants as given because it has to elicit migrants from another member state. And also it has to take the union-wide rate of return on capital as given because of the arbitrage across these member states because of capital mobility. But by taking all this as given in a competitive regime, it ignores the fact that when it adopts fiscal migration policy and tax on capital policy that admits an extra migrant or an extra unit of capital, it raises the well-being that must be accorded to migrants not only in it, but also in all other union member countries, because they also have to uplift these benefits in order to attract through competition labor and capital. And there is the fiscal externality. Now, in the next few slides, you can see simulation of the model. And the simulation are in terms of the share of high-skilled migrants in the competitive regime versus the coordination regime, in terms of social benefits that is provided by each member state in the competitive regime versus the coordination regime, and in terms of taxes on labor and capital. So let's start with high skill or the migrant skill composition. So competition, as you can see from the graph, yields more high-skilled migrants and low migrants and smaller I'm sorry, I repeat. Competition yields less high-skilled migrants than coordination. So if you remember in the US, which is more like a coordination regime, there is more high-skilled migrants, and this graph supports through the model this kind of consequence of how governance is different between the two federal systems. Now, in terms of the tax rates on labor and capital, the competition regime, as well as the coordination regime, yield higher capital tax than in coordination. And coordination yields higher labor tax rate than competition. Again, it is reminiscent of the differences between capital tax rates and labor tax rates in the US versus Europe. And most importantly, and that's sort of the so-called punchline of the whole exercise, is about the generosity of the welfare state. These graphs show that coordinating the fiscal and migration policies, the so-called coordination regime, allows the union member states to offer less generous social benefits as compared to when they compete with each other. And the rationale for this result is rooted in the fiscal externality and the tax competition and the fiscal competition that is dominant in the competition regime. Now, in addition to differences in governance between US and the EU, there are other issues that are abstracted from the model that I just presented. And there is very important difference in demographics. The aging of the population is a fundamental factor that's related to, of course, to the generosity of the welfare state and the composition of taxes. And that's not part of the model that I just established. And it calls for new modeling that we are doing in a different setup about the effect of aging on federal systems. Just as a footnote, I would remind the Chinese audience about the important issue of aging, because I think in your last census, it was, I guess, the first time that the Chinese population is shrinking basically because of lack of lower fertility rates and the lack of in-migration that usually inject new, younger labor force into a country. End of the footnote. So the aging of the population is also a difference between the EU and the US, nothing to do with governance. So in 2010, the proportion of people aged 65 and older constituted 13% in the US, where in the EU countries it was so much higher share, 20% in Germany, 20% in Italy, 16% in France, and UK that after Brexit left the EU, but in 2010 it was still in the EU, was 16%. Although the population in the US is getting older, its numbers are growing more slowly. The demographic future of the US is younger than that of the core EU countries. And obviously, aging has, as I told you before, important consequences for the generosity of the welfare state for the composition of taxation. So here is a graph comparing the age dependency ratio of Germany versus the US, and you see how the German age dependency ratio, old age dependency ratio, is much higher than in the US. So with this brief comments and presentation, I I would like to thank you for your being the audience of my paper with Efraim Sadka.